let's turn now to this work of John Stuart Mill, The System of Logic, Ratiocinative and Deductive of 1843. And I'll just read to you and then we can discuss. To the logician, if a Negro and a white man differ in the same manner, however less in degree, as a horse and camel do, that is, if their differences are inexhaustible and not referable to any common cause, they are different species, whether they are descended from common ancestors or not. But if their differences can all be traced to climate and habits, or to some one or a few species, special differences in structure, they are not, in the logician's view, specifically distinct. That is to say, distinct with reference to species, right? Now, there are a lot of comments I could make. I could spend an hour just talking about this one passage. I'll try to limit it to a few points of explication. First of all, it is striking, is it not, to see this particular question attributed to logic, to the logician, Mill says. Ordinarily, we do not think of the question of, let's say, the metaphysics and science of racial difference as a question for logic. That's in part because Mill's conception of what logic is more capacious than ours, but also in part because he is thinking about the question as a conceptual matter and not as one that is strictly, say, of interest to the science of what was coming to call biology or genetics. Elsewhere in the same work, he explicates this idea that natural kind is something that is such that the differences that members of natural kind X have from every other thing in the world are, as he repeats again here, inexhaustible and not simply based on an initial principle of grouping. And the example that he uses for a candidate natural kind is white thing, right? Not white person, but white thing, right? Now, take all the white things in the universe and put them in a pile together, and then start sorting through the pile and try to determine whether all of those white things in the universe that we put together initially on the basis of their whiteness have something else beyond that initial basis of classification besides in common. And of course, they don't, right? All white things have in common is the fact that they're white, right? So white thing then does not constitute a natural kind. That's what a natural kind is. That's the definition of natural kind. Now, the crucial phrase in this long passage that I want to highlight, however, is right in the middle, when Mill rejects the idea that shared ancestry is crucial for determining shared membership in a kind. He says that two beings, in this case, as he puts it, the Negro and the white, two beings can be members of different species, whether they are descended from common ancestors or not. Now, I want to highlight that part of this passage as the key departure from the way the question of the status of racial difference had been discussed in Europe for the previous few centuries. Mill is here detaching the notion of shared kindred from the notion of common ancestry. And that would have been, in the past, prior to an incoherent move to make. What this does in turn, and we can talk about this more in discussion, is renders irrelevant the question of common origins, which had previously been conceptualized as shared descent from the same first parents, that is, shared descent from Adam and Eve. It detaches the importance of shared descent from the same first parents from the question of shared essence and also, of course, shared community. And so the ethical and political implications of this and what this move now permits for racialized, for racist discourses in the late 20th centuries, I think should be obvious, but again, we can return to that in further discussion. Okay, now let's go way back from Mill, who comes too late for the period I actually want to talk about. Let's go much, much earlier than the period I want to actually talk about to discuss for a moment Aristotle. Aristotle, well, I don't want you to see the quotation yet because then your eyes will focus on it. So let me just introduce a little bit what I want to say about Aristotle. In many respects, Aristotle defines the template for thinking about biological kindhood as a paradigmatic form of natural kindhood. Well into the 17th and 18th centuries, and is only fully displaced in the 19th century, around the same time Mill is writing, of course, with the rise of mature evolutionary thought. So let's just turn to this passage, Aristotle on biological kinds. For since the nature of a kind, Aristotle writes, cannot be eternal, that which comes into being is eternal in the way that is possible for it. Now, it is not possible in number, for the being of existing things is particular, and if this were such, it would be eternal. But it is possible in form. Sorry, that's a typo. It should be form and not form. That is why there is always a kind of men and of animals and of plants. Now, this is a very obscure passage in Aristotle's treatise on the generation of animals. But what is significant about it is that it grounds the eternity of biological bonds, the fact that they are permanently and essentially bound off from one another in, so to speak, a generative cycle. Aristotle elsewhere in the same work says that an animal kind cycles back upon itself in sexual reproduction, right? So the metaphysical and cosmological scheme within which all of this is happening, the idea is, the best thing would be to be eternal as an individual, right? Like God. Or like the celestial spheres. They just keep existing as the individuals they are for all of eternity. But because we are sublunar creatures, we are therefore composed of different elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and because we're composed, we must therefore decompose at some point, which means we must die, which is to say we're mortal, which is to say that we procure for ourselves that meager amount of eternity that is available to us, which is eternity in kind, or in species, or as it's put here, in form, right? Which is to say, before we die, we are at least able to generate little members of the same species to which we belong, right? The idea here, though, is that this is a closed circle, right? And as a circle, it's infinite and ultimately unchanging. Circular motion is unchanging in the sense that we always arrive back at the same point. So for him, indeed, biological kinds can be true natural kinds in that they really don't have a history, right? There's nowhere they come from and nowhere they're going. They've just always been here, sharing in eternity to the extent possible, right? Now, maybe as a minor footnote, because what really interests us here is the diversity of humankinds, what is Aristotle's view on race? Well, it's very complicated. He certainly recognizes what we would think of as phenotypic difference from one region to another. He recognizes that typically Ethiopians have a different skin color than Greeks. For example, he does not thematize this as an essential difference. There is a further discussion in Aristotle, as you probably know, of the question of whether there's such a thing as a natural slave, that is, a person who is born suited to slavery, and he seems to suggest that some groups of people as wholes are more suited to slavery than others. He never says which groups of people those are, and this also doesn't seem to imply any kind of a commitment to an essential difference between groups, right? He also thinks that men and women are essentially different, and indeed that women are inferior to men, but that doesn't imply any kind of essential difference. It rather implies a complicated, let's say, impediment to the progress of certain human beings toward the full excellence of humanity as a result of causes that are external to their essence or form, which is to say material causes, right? So Aristotle on equality and inequality and human difference is an extremely complicated topic. Incidentally, it's worth noting that that Aristotle on inequality will become very important in the 16th century in the context of the so-called Valladolid debates in Spain on the status of Native Americans. And this is a kind of sequence of scholastic disputations held in Spain in the 1550s. Most importantly, though, there were others that came earlier and later on whether Native Americans are suited for slavery or not. And this is entirely against a background of Aristotelian presuppositions about what constitutes equality and inequality, right? So in this respect, it's a very, very significant moment in the early modern period, because later the people who interest me primarily, for example, Leibniz, Feuerbach, Kant, and others, are no longer so beholden to ancient and in particular Aristotelian ideas about human nature and human essence as to try to conceptualize and understand the new realities of the modern world, of the post-contact globalized world in strictly Aristotelian terms. Maybe we can return to the 16th century Spanish debates in discussion. The classic work on this is Anthony Pagin's book from 1983, I think, called The Fall of Natural Man. And there's another great book, the title of which I'm forgetting, called Aristotle and the Native Americans. But let's move on. Let's try to move on to the person who interests me most, who is Wilhelm Leibniz. Before I wrote this book, I wrote another book called Divine Machines, Leibniz and the Sciences of Life. This came out in 2011. And I was particularly interested in understanding Leibniz's departures from Aristotle on the ins and outs of, in particular, sexual generation, but more narrowly also the theory that Leibniz attempted to develop of reproduction, right? And I distinguish here between generation and reproduction. We often use these interchangeably, but you'll notice reproduction, like if you think, for example, of what a copying machine does, for example, it reproduces a document. It doesn't just give you any document whatsoever. It gives you the same document that you put on the glass, right? So reproduction is a narrower notion than generation. And indeed, it pinpoints a phenomenon in nature that is much more difficult to explain. That is, how you get not only some creature or other generated from parents, but rather, moreover, a creature of the same kind as the parents, right? And this is something that would not really be adequately understood until the 20th century, right? Even Mendel, in the late 19th century, just kind of has to say, look, something happens with these pea pods and these alleles that makes the offspring share in the traits of parents. We'll work it out later. So the 17th century, for this reason, is a really conceptually very interesting time period because it is a huge conceptual vacuum, right? A vacuum opens up with the rejection of Aristotelian natural philosophy at the beginning of the 17th century. People have no idea how to explain basic phenomena that had previously been accounted for in terms of the metaphysics of form and matter. And this conceptual vacuum remains open for 300 years, with many, many people acknowledging that the life sciences are just, for now, a huge question, right? The prevailing explanatory scheme from the early 17th century, with Descartes and others of his generation, is mechanism, or sometimes, as it's called, the mechanical philosophy. That is, to give it a succinct definition, whatever happens in nature happens as a result of the mass, figure, and motion of fundamental particles, right? If an iron bar gets hot, for example, that's not because of some irreducible qualitative change in the bar. That is because there are little particles in there that are moving faster than when it was cold, right? Now, Descartes wanted to say that this extends all the way to the problem of animal generation. That is, when you've got a being generated, this is just the result of the conglomeration of numerous particles in the, as they thought at the time, in the blood of the mother, triggered into forming by the semen of the father, that then eventually coagulates into a proto-heart, and then all the other organs divide off of that, and so on and so on. And Descartes says very explicitly in the Traité de la formation du fœtus, the treatise on the formation of the fetus, which was only published posthumously, Descartes says very explicitly, if I cannot explain the generation of animals from minor causes, as he puts it, that is, from the mass, figure, and motion of particles, if I cannot explain the generation of animals in the same manner as I already explained ballistics, the orbit of planets, the communication of force between billiard balls, all of that stuff, Descartes says, if I cannot explain this natural phenomenon as well, in the same way, then all of my philosophy is worth nothing. That's what Descartes says. But ultimately, what he's doing when he pretends to explain the formation of the fetus is just taking a shot in the dark, right? And again, that's not his fault. He's just 300 years too early. Right? There's a lot of further scientific information that needs to come along to fill this out. Now, because of this shot in the dark quality of this kind of explanation in the period, there are some figures, and I can cite, for example, Nicolas Malebranche, the author of the treatise called The Search After Truth of 1676, who says, look, we might be able to explain generation in general in terms of minor causes, but how you could explain why it is that horses always give birth reliably to foals, and partridges to partridges, and crows to crows, and so on. Why, as they often said, like always begets like, is something that the mechanical philosophy is just never going to be able to explain, right? So there were a lot of defectors from this explanatory unity of the mechanical philosophy who made a special exception for biological generation. There were, and what did they do? Well, some of them invoked special immaterial formative principles that looked quite a bit like the Aristotelian theory of form. And these went by various names like plastic nature or archeos, things like that. So it was like kind of like a composite mechanism slash formalism. Others, like Leibniz, and people come to Leibniz, took a different approach. How did Leibniz adhere to the mechanical philosophy while not just throwing his hands up in desperation at the question of the explanation of generation? Well, he denied that there is such a thing as generation, right? Generation never actually happens. What happens instead is that every single being that exists has always existed, right? That's just what the creation of the world was. It was the creation of all corporeal substances, which includes all human beings and all animals and plants. And basically, for Leibniz, everything that actually exists is something analogous to an animal or a plant, and he supposes that soon enough, when microscopes get more powerful, when we break down the constitution of, say, a rock or volcanic lava or whatever, we'll see that all of that too actually has what he calls an organic structure. That is to say, that it is irreducibly, infinitely structured in the same way that animals and plants are, right? And so because there's an infinite structure to a plant or an animal, it's a corollary of this infinity that it can never be created or destroyed except miraculously by God. right? And this is a very interesting moment, of course, because this is a theory that's developed in the wake of Anthony van Leeuwenhoek's 1672 discovery of animal spermatozoa by use of a microscope. This was, as Leibniz put it, empirical corroboration of a thesis that, according to him, according to Leibniz, could be held on a priori grounds for metaphysical reasons. The animal has to pre-exist somewhere, and Leeuwenhoek found the locus of its pre-existence, right? Now, what happens after death? Presumably something similar, just as there's a microscopic animalcule that at conception enters into the larger theater, so too at death there is, as Leibniz puts it, a retreat into the smaller theater. And this means presumably that animals just float around in pond scum or on the breeze for all eternity without ever leaving nature, right? It's a bit harder to follow in the case of human beings because, strictly speaking, we're supposed to have a disembodied afterlife, eternal salvation or perdition. In my opinion, that's a tack-on for Leibniz. He doesn't want to actually hold that. So if you want to know what Leibniz actually thinks about these things, it's best to pay attention to what he has to say about animals rather than about human beings, right? Okay, so again, what we're interested in is race, and that's where we're going. But I wanted to give you a lot of history and philosophy of biology and natural philosophy in general in order to be able to really get the full background to what Leibniz in particular, but also, as we'll see, Buffon and Kant and a few other people have to say about human diversity in particular. All right, so race, as many researchers have noted this in recent years, I'm certainly not the first, though it is more evident, kind of more obvious in the context of French historical writing than Anglophone. Also, I could mention Italian and continental authors in general, simply in virtue of the fact that in many non-English cases, race and breed are the same word, right? That is to say, in French, one speaks of the race des chiens, for example, say German Shepherds or Golden Pinschers or Gordons. Those are races of dog, right? It's still the same word in French, for example. Now, this is a peculiarity of language that is revealing of a significant historical fact, which is to say that the term starts to be used first in Italian in the mid to late 16th century, and then in French by the early 17th century, starts to be used exclusively in the domain of animal husbandry, right? So a race is, in this period, exclusively a race of domestic animal, right? In particular, horses and cattle, and goats and sheep and also dogs. And in the early 17th century, there are disputes over where this first pops up. But in the early 17th century, probably first in the Ibero-American Hispanophone context, this makes a leap from the discussion of animal husbandry to the discussion of royal lineage, right? And this is significant. There's a famous line from Karl Marx. I'm sure I'll get it wrong, but he says somewhat snidely that when it comes right down to it, aristocracy is a branch of zoology, right? And it's pretty clear what he means by this, right? If you think about this remarkable kind of point of historical contact, whereby a term familiar in animal husbandry makes the leap to our understanding of human difference and human diversity. It's not originally when authors were thinking about the great masses of people or nations, as they would have said it in the era. Rather, it was in the context of thinking about the succession of royal lineages, right? And so with this, I want to turn to a first passage from Leibniz. A few comments on it before I let you see the passage. Leibniz was, some of you might know, among other things, for his day job, a genealogist. That is to say, he was employed by the Duke of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel to do the medieval genealogy of the House of Guelph Este. The Duke of Wolfenbüttel belonged to the House of Guelph. They knew they had some centuries old connections to the House of Este, which was primarily in northern Italy. And so there was a practical, material, financial urgency to determining who had offspring with whom over the previous roughly 8 centuries, right? So Leibniz was employed as a medieval genealogist in this particular focused capacity, right? But Leibniz being Leibniz, he couldn't just do his job. He had to allow this narrow task to expand and take on theoretical dimensions. So while he began to do his genealogical work in the 1680s, by the 1690s, what we see is a proliferation of texts by Leibniz that could be called ethno-linguistic. That is, treatises of an ethno-linguistic nature, in which he tries to give an account of the origins of various nations, in particular by the study of language, where, as he insists, the vocabulary, the lexicon, is a sort of repository of, as he puts it, ancient monuments, right? And so, and I don't have time to flesh this out in full, but I take it that his ethno-linguistic treatises, the treatise on the origins of the Germanic peoples, the treatise on the origins of the Slavs, the treatise on the origins of the nations of Transylvania, and so on, I see all of that as kind of radiating directly out of this original work as a genealogist. Now, that's one point. Another point is, when you come to doing work on Leibniz, one often doesn't read treatises, one doesn't even read letters, one ends up reconstructing his thought by focusing first and foremost on marginalia. He was an obsessive writer and commenter, so we have traces of a good number of his thoughts on a day-to-day basis, but that means we often have to go and look at some very, very fine-grained marginalia, which often aren't even written in complete sentences, just key words. And that's the case for this passage I want to look at with you together right now. Rasse, Genus, Geschlecht. So he gives the same word in 3 different languages, equivalencies, and this is significant. Well, let me just read the whole thing, and then I can comment. Rasse, Genus, Geschlecht, Series, Generation. And then the final line in Latin, genealogy is the explication of this series, right? I'm sorry, I meant to put the translation, please, to the final sentence, but I think it should be simple enough. So, the same word in 3 different languages. Race, 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 right? Rasse, Genus, Geschlecht, and then period, and then what seems to be, by the kind of pragmatics these fragments, a definition of those 2 words, series of generations. So what is a race? It's a series of generations. And genealogy is the explication of this series. Now this is, there's so many things I could say about this. Again, it's like the passage from Mill. I could talk about this for an hour, but I don't want to do that. One thing that's significant to note here is that genus sometimes, one thing that we often note is that in contrast with concepts like nation and people, the term race never occurs before the mid to late 16th century, right? Now, there is a simple linguistic explanation for why, and that is because before the mid to late 16th century, people didn't write in the vernaculars. They wrote in Latin, and race has no equivalent in Latin. It has no precise equivalent in Latin. In fact, the etymology of race is disputed. Some people say it might be a back formation from the Latin generatio. So somehow the first half of generatio just got cut off, and ratio became razza, and then eventually rasa. That's possible. It might also have an Arabic verbal root. It's very hard to say, but in any case, the simple reason why no one said race or a cognate before the late 16th century is because no one was writing in the vernaculars. And when they do start to write in vernaculars, they kind of retroactively make race a synonym of genus, right? And genus, of course, is a very well-attested word in classical Latin, but it's also very clear in classical Latin that most of the time when genus is used, it's nothing like either what Leibniz means here by genus, or let alone what people today might mean by race. I could also say a few words about Geschlecht, but I think I'll skip that and say that this is also in German a standard, a term standardly translated by gender, right? Which is significant if you think about the thematic pairing that is so common today of race and gender, right? What we're getting at, in essence, is just anything that marks out difference within the kind. Now, a further point I wanted to make about this is that the notion here, by defining race as a series of generations, and genealogy is the explication of this series, is that this is a fundamentally temporal notion. Elsewhere, in a treatise that comes much later, in 1709, Leibniz returns to the term, and it's been several decades since he gave a formal definition of it. He returns to the term and says that the series of generations that we call race is a unique sort of series in that one member must continue at least to the moment of the existence of the subsequent member, and presumably a little bit beyond. Well, what does that mean? It means that a mother has to live up until the time the child is born, right? That is to say, you don't have a succession of generations without a partial overlap of generations, at least a partial overlap. So this is an attempt to really formally, rigorously, quasi-mathematically define a special kind of series. In the context, I note in this particular passage, a commentary on a draft by Wilkins, an English mathematician and philosopher, of a so-called characteristic of universalis, that is to say, a formal language in which all terms will be rigorously defined. So that's how Leibniz defines race in the late 1670s, probably. It's a temporal notion, it's an unfolding series, and moreover, being a member of this series is something that has nothing to do with the inspectable properties of the individual member, right? Think back to John Stuart Mill on camels and horses. Do they have a common ancestor? Who cares, Mill says. The hump that the camel has, the absence of the hump in the horse, that marks out a huge difference, more things, in virtue of which it's fair to call them different species, regardless of whether they have a common ancestor or not. For Leibniz here, by contrast, there's no mention of, to put it kind of crudely, humps, right? There's no mention of phenotypical properties of individual members of the species. They don't matter. All that matters is being formally a member of a temporal series, right? And by this definition alone, you could have any number of different properties and still be a member of the same class in species. Now, what word is missing in this polyglot definition? It's one that we already saw Mill using quite aggressively, that you need to flag at this point, and that is species. There's something strange going on in the history of both of these concepts, race and species, and the way they cross paths briefly in the late 17th century. Why do I say that? Well, species, and I'm sorry to lay heavy on the etymology, but I think it can be really revealing. You'll notice the word species shares the same root as, say, spectacles, spectacular, inspect, and so on. It is a root that originally had most to do with vision. And in fact, in medieval Latin theories of vision, the so-called species of a thing was the visible, the inspectable outer surface that is communicated to the sensory organs of the perceiving, right? This is remarkable because it means that in effect, the species of a thing is superficial, right? The species is what is outwardly inspectable, in contrast with the inner essence of the thing, right? So sometimes in the 17th century then, you get the most remarkable distinction between race and species, where it's exactly the reverse of the way these two terms would tend to be used in the 19th and 20th, perhaps in the 21st centuries, where the species is, so to speak, the skin deep aspect of a thing. Again, that which is inspectable, whereas the race is that which unites the thing to its ancestors, right? So whether or not a given descendant of ancestors has different species properties, that is visible properties, than the ancestors. It's the transtemporal union with the ancestors that makes it the same kind of thing, right? Very complicated, but I think conceptually also very important. All right. Now, who's responsible for this reversal? I don't have much time to go into this, but the person who is often invoked as the founder of so-called racial science, and I take for granted that we understand that by racial science we mean racial pseudoscience. It's not a real science, but the attempts to describe within the vocabulary, the conceptual framework of natural philosophy, human diversity between 1650 and 1950, which these attempts will become, on my account, increasingly overtly racist as time goes on, but they remain racial science / racial pseudoscience to the extent that they're using the framework of science to try to account for racial diversity. So the first person to attempt, as he puts it, a division of the entire human kind, and I say kind as a generic term in order to not say species, because that's a term we've already problematized. The first person to attempt a division of the entire humankind into a few basic subtypes is François Bernier. And a few words about Bernier. He's a peculiar person. He was a protege, a disciple, and so to speak, an apostle of the French materialist, crypto-atheist philosopher Pierre Gassendi. Among other things, he wrote an abrégé de la philosophie de Pierre Gassendi, a kind of compendium of the philosophy of Gassendi. Bernier was also court physician of the emperor of the Mughal Empire in Delhi in the 1660s. And so also we need to understand him as, so to speak, a travel author in the really modern sense. And there are some historians, the Portuguese South Asia historian Juan Paulo Rubius has argued that Bernier's, let's say, human subtype divisions have conceptual precedent in lessons he may have learned within the cultural Persian Mongol Empire in northern India. I won't go into that. You can read Google's references. In any case, comes back to France some decades later, 1686. He publishes the so-called Nouvelle Edition de la Terre, 1684, in which he states the goal for, although the exterior form of the body, and particularly of the face, men are almost all different from one another, depending on the cantons of the earth in which they live, so that those who have traveled a good deal can often distinguish in this way without mistake each nation in particular. I have nevertheless remarked that there are above all 4 or 5, now note this, note the phrasing, 4 or 5 species or races of men, right? So here he's using these as synonyms. Espèce ou race is the original French. That's significant. Sometimes they're opposed, they have the meanings that are opposite to the way we use them, and sometimes they overlap perfectly, as is the theory of Danier. So I nevertheless remarked that there are above all 4 or 5 species or races of men whose difference is so great that it could serve as a good foundation for a new division of the world, right? So the idea here is that, there's a long tradition of what you might call national physiognomy, Europeans making remarks of the sort, well, the Flems are very tall, and the Celts are or whatever, things like that. Whether or not these are true or accurate, whether they map on reality, all is another question, but national physiognomy goes way back. And the idea of nation here is something that Danier explicitly contrasts with species or races. So let's forget about nation. In this newly globalized era, there is something more basic than nation, and that is the division into 4 or 5 basic transnational species or races, right? Then he goes on to give a kind of sloppy, half-hearted division that is somewhat interesting. It's interesting to note that for him, East Asians are in the first so-called white category. That is, he explicitly says that the Japanese and Chinese are white. The divisions of Africa are rather complicated. He says that East Africans are probably not fully one race or the other, probably thinking of Ethiopians. And there are a lot of very kind of fine-grained details that are historically curious. And of course, for Bernier, as for Kant, as for everyone else, there's implicit hierarchy. It's not for nothing that he puts white first. And also, it's very significant that for Bernier, as for many other people, until well into the 18th century, implicitly or even explicitly at the bottom of the hierarchy, it's not who you think. It is, in fact, the so-called Laps, or Laplanders, which is, by Bernier, as by many others, a group of people that you could say has a kind of quasi-mythological status. The ethnographic details are very, very minimal. These authors know that nobody is going to call them on this, and typically they say things to the effect that the Laps are probably half bear, that is to say, hybrids of humans and bears, in any case, marking them out as subhuman, but it's always a far northern Arctic boreal people that comes in implicitly in last place. So, I mean, this treatise, I could go on and on about this, but it's a remarkable treatise in that it is so sloppy and such a half measure. It's only 3 or 4 pages long, and by the end of it, Bernier is just kind of relating his own personal travel adventures, and he's forgotten about his theoretical ambitions. And you know, maybe this is a fitting start for the centuries-long history of a pseudoscience. One might want to criticize the students for being sloppy and bad, but then at the same time, I also want to say, what do you expect from the inaugural treatise of a pseudoscience? But maybe that's too much judgment on my part. Okay. Now, what I wanted to emphasize here, and there's a fascinating history of the overlap between Leibniz and Bernier. In the 1690s, Leibniz summarizes by memory this article that we just cited from Bernier. In a little memo, he summarizes it in Latin. He uses Italian words in parentheses, which makes it possible for us to pinpoint the context in which Leibniz was apparently trying to summarize the treatise he read for an Italian correspondent. Anyhow, Leibniz dies in 1716. One of the people rifling through his papers finds this summary of Bernier's text, mistakes the summary for something Leibniz himself claimed, and publishes it in one of the first posthumous publications of Leibniz's assorted minor works, right? Blumenbach, in turn, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, in 1775, in the treatise on the innate differences of mankind, Blumenbach invokes the name of Leibniz as the great founder of our science of human races, right? So Blumenbach conflates Leibniz and Bernier as a result of this confusion shortly after Leibniz's death, and Leibniz is often cited as one of the first classifiers of human beings into 4 or 5 basic subtypes, of the sort that Bernier inaugurates and of the sort that Blumenbach repeats more or less unaltered about 75, almost 100 years later. Now, this is significant because according to my argument, and I can't give you all the details, but according to my argument in the book, in fact, what we have is 2 competing conceptions of race, the one represented by Leibniz and the one represented by Bernier, coming into collision, and Bernier's ultimately will be the one that triumphs. That is to say, the vision of race that is, let's say, useful for classification and indifferent to ancestry or to the question of common origins is the one that will supersede the conception of race that is fundamentally temporal and about temporal succession, and that is indifferent not to ancestry, but rather to phenotype or to morphological traits, right? And this is part of my argument that, and again, my purpose as a historian of philosophy and of science is not to hand out laurels to certain people and to, give raspberries to other people. I'm just trying to figure out what they said. But if I had to hand out laurels, I do, and this, even after having read John Horbach's criticism of my position, if I had to hand out laurels, I would insist, and I continue to insist, and insisted in the book in some detail, that Leibniz's conception of race would have been more compatible with a universal theory of human equality that could coexist with true political and economic equality over the next several centuries, which did not happen. right? By contrast, Vernier's conception of race is one that was well suited to the rise of a racialized global order. And I can say a few more words about that, though I might want to leave this for discussion. I would just invoke, and here I don't have a quotation to show you, some interesting paragraphs of Leibniz's 1704 Nouveaux essais sur l'entendement humain, which is the new essays on human understanding, which is a response to John Locke's 1690 essay concerning human understanding. Now, Locke had died in 1704, so Locke was already dead when Leibniz's reply to him came out. But Leibniz's new essays of 1704 is a sort of dialogue with a fictionalized version of John Locke. Now, in John Locke's 1690 work, Locke, as an empiricist, is making the case that there is no such thing as essential difference. To put it differently, to put in Locke's terms, there are no real essences. That is to say, among other things, that there is no essential difference between, say, humans and orangutans. And the orangutan will, in the 18th century, become a conceptual kind of thought experiment as much as an actual zoological sorting term. Orangutan typically included both chimpanzees and Pongo, that is to say, the actual orangutan of Indonesia. So Locke would say there is no real essence that distinguishes human beings from orangutans. It's just a question of nominal essence. It's just a question of where we ourselves draw the lines, and that's just a matter of simple empiricism. All you can observe in nature are inspectable properties of things. You'll notice that some things have more in common with other things. We can group those things together if we want, and it's up to us, right? And Locke then gives us a kind of early iteration of the ultimately extremely racist King Kong myth, saying that he's heard from seafarers that on the coast of Africa there are apes who abduct women and have hybrid children with them. Are those hybrid children human beings or not? Locke says, it's up to us to decide. There's nothing the world imposes on us when we're seeking to answer that question. It's the way we want to carve things up. In fact, Locke says, here in England, I myself even saw an animal that seems to have been the hybrid of a cat and a rat. Which is probably some ferret or something. Did that cat rat have the cat essence or the rat essence or both or neither? It's up to us to decide, right? That's Locke's view. So in the new essays of Leibniz, 14 years later, Leibniz explicitly says, and it's a weird line, there's a lot I would have to give you to flesh it out. In between these two, in between 1690 and 1704, there's the 1699 so-called orang-utan, which is an anatomical study by the English physician Edward Tyson of the cadaver of a chimpanzee, of a baby chimpanzee, which he refers to as the Homo sylvestris, which is just the Latinized form of the Malay orang-utan, that is to say, man of the woods, or Sylvester man, or forest man. And Tyson's conclusion is that anatomically speaking, there is not enough of a difference between this chimpanzee and a human being to say that human beings have souls and chimpanzees don't, right? So therefore, Tyson concludes, whatever it is that confers to us our special essence must be something non-anatomical, that is to say, an immaterial soul, right? We better put all our eggs in the dualist immaterial soul basket, because otherwise we can't secure any real difference of ourselves from chimpanzees. Now, Leibniz invokes this work of Tyson's in a weird passage in the New Essays of 1704 in order to say, it's a strange line, but what he says is the man of the woods, even if he is hairy, even if he has a tail, will make himself known to us. Now that line is often skipped over. It's not at all clear what in itself what Leibniz is trying to say, unless you know the debate with Locke and you know the context of reading Tyson's treatise. But the idea is that, for Leibniz, it is ultimately an all or nothing question whether a human being is a human being or not. And a human being can, in fact, deviate significantly from what a European might take, rightly or wrongly, to be a normative human being, right? And in fact, Leibniz goes on to invoke notions from what we think of as disability to say that sometimes human beings are born with developmental obstacles that prevent them from speaking and therefore from conveying their capacity for reason, but this isn't the grounds for excluding them from human species. So in general, Leibniz is developing there an account of a kind of threshold definition of what it is to be a human being, which is entirely detached from considerations of morphology or of particular physical traits, right? And Leibniz is able to do this because he has a prior commitment to defining a kind, a living kind, as one that is fundamentally, essentially temporal, grounded in the sharing of essence, right? So I'm going to wrap up there with Leibniz. I just wanted to say a few words about other developments. Just give me 5 minutes here, and then we can open it up for discussion. What else is going on in the 18th century? So Bernier's treatise is in 1684. Leibniz dies in 1716, and we can think of the beginnings of racial science as, in a certain respect, rigorous physical anthropology, skeletometry in particular, as beginning in the 1770s with Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Bernier is not a physical anthropologist of any sort. In the intervening several decades, the first several decades of the 18th century, we have a couple of very significant developments. One of them is, of course, the contribution of Linnaeus, the so-called system of nature, which is a work of taxonomy. Linnaeus, like other taxonomists, does not feel compelled, given the scope of the science of taxonomy, to define what it is to be a member of a certain kind. He's just out there classifying. What is significant about his system of nature that distinguishes it from others of the genre? This isn't the, so to speak, the proper name of a work, the Systema Naturae. Rather, systems of nature were a whole genre that had existed for several centuries. What's new about Linnaeus's contribution to this genre in particular is that he places the human being among the so-called anthropomorpha And here you see different names, all of which are basically antiquated. The names are all antiquated, and the figures are obviously quasi-mythological. The two on the right, that is our right, are presumably chimpanzee, taken to be different species. Tulps, satyr, and Edward's pygmy. The two on the left are evidently descended more from Herodotus and from the mythology of travelers coming back from antiquity. Now, the significant thing is that Linnaeus places Homo among the anthropomorphic, right? Which is an astounding move, right? First of all, it sounds a bit weird to say that that man is an anthropomorph, right? Because anthropomorph just means that which has the form of a man. So of course, a man has the form of a man. He is a man, right? But while being agnostic, being non-committal about what this placement means for our understanding of what it is to be a good being, simply the taxonomical, so to speak, the discursive practice of placing Homo there alongside the Satyrius and the Neus is a significant part of a double movement towards the naturalization of human beings, which will, I argue, be an important kind of opening of the floodgates to scientific racism in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's a double movement. What is the other part of this double movement? Well, it's subdividing Homo, the anthropomorph, into further basic subtypes. For example, the Europaeus albus, that is to say the white European, the Americanus rubescens, that is to say the ruddy American, Africanus niger, the black African, and so on, right? And so one might argue that in a sense, once the first part of this motion of analysis is initiated, that is to say, the insertion of Homo into a natural order alongside other anthropomorpha, the impediment to further subdivision of Homo is lifted, right? You can place the kind alongside other natural kinds, and moreover, you can find, so to speak, grains or joints within what we had previously taken to be a homogeneous kind, right? And so Linnaeus's work, I argue, is continuous with Bernier's in that it gives us no theoretical or metaphysical or scientific elaboration of what it is to belong to different subtypes of the human species. It just says, here are some subtypes. And if the question is, where do these come from? The answer would be, I'm not a natural historian, let alone a biblical scholar or any number of other disciplines that might be able to furnish us answers to that whence question. I'm just a taxonomer. All I do is subdivide. And my argument is that that is what creates the discursive possibility of coming to think of what would previously been considered superficial traits, like color coding, right? Like albus rubescens, fuscus niger, and so on, as marking out real types irrespective of shared ancestry, and what gives rise over the subsequent centuries to the conceptual kind of legitimation of the new conceptualized as noble order. And so there's a lot that I didn't consider here. I can fend off any anticipated question about whether it's even worthwhile to talk about the intellectual history of racism, given that it's also obviously generated by material, economic, and political realities. I know that, but I had to kind of choose a narrower topic for my work for this particular book, and so what I looked at was the discursive practices of a few authors engaged in theoretical endeavors. That's not to deny the material and economic political realities, it's just to try to carve off a different dimension of this very complicated history. And I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
So questions, discussion points? I wouldn't mind starting off, Susan Douglas here, with asking how this racial system somehow connects to the biblical story of the sons of Noah and becomes popularized in some way. That may take us off track here, but I'm really curious about it.
No, that's really important, and I do address some of these issues in your book. Now, in 16th century polygenism, you have a number of so-called freethinkers. This is particularly an Italian phenomenon, people like Giordano Bruno and Lucio Vanini, who are arguing that the Native Americans in particular are born of the earth and therefore are not descended from Adam and Eve. And this is, it is two things at once. It's grossly racist by our standards. It's also an attempt to carve out a bit of a space for a naturalistic account of human origins, one that doesn't remain tethered to biblical accounts, right? And so they tread this line carefully. Vanini didn't tread it carefully enough. He got his tongue cut out by the Inquisition. But still, the idea was to say, like, look, I'm not denying we're descending from Adam and Eve, but let's just consider the possibility that maybe some human or humanoid creatures could be born of the earth really far away from here. And then over the course of the 17th century, you have people like, I could say, Isaac Laterre, for example, the exponent of the so-called pre-Adamite theory, that is Adamite, A-D-A-M-I-T-E, who wants to argue that there's an obscure reference in the Old Testament to the other tribes besides the ones that who are these other people Cain and Abel come in contact with. So Laperriere uses this as a scriptural basis for arguing that that every people has, so to speak, its own Adam and Eve, or that there were equivalent Adams and Eves before our own Adam and Eve, and there could, for example, be an Adam and Eve of the Americans, and by the 17th century, there's also sufficient, so to speak, othering of Africans that you also get the consideration of the possibility of an African Adam and Eve. In the 16th century, it's only Americans, not Africans. By the 17th century, also Africans. So what you have in Laperriere is the attempt to find a scriptural basis for a polygenesis theory of human origins that fractures between species. But for the most part, everyone who remains committed to the truth of Scripture remains also committed to the unity of the human species. And that's just basically like a default view from the 16th to the 18th centuries. And then it starts to, you start to find a lot of counterexamples in the kind of very kind of mutant extremist strains of scientific racism in the 19th century in the United States that use scripture for alongside pseudoscientific accounts of the distinct origins of people of African descent. But that's a period and a region that I know significantly less about. But overall, what you see from the 16th to the 18th centuries is a gradual kind of easing up of the need to account for human unity and diversity in terms that even pay lip service to the official line of scripture, the official line being the unity of the human species in virtue of our shared descent from Adam.
I have several questions, just for leadership. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to passages in Plato's Republic and what your views there. Also uses of ethnos or ethnikos, either in New Testament or elsewhere. And also, you say in your chapter 6, you talk about the French, the old French like greeting. I just wondered if you could talk about that and how Dernier spells vas. Does he spell two S's or C? Or he spells two S's?
Okay, the last part of this is easy. It's with a it's the same spelling as today. It's R-A-C-E, the same as in French today. I was having trouble hearing some of what you said. There's another proposed etymology, indeed, that I failed to mention. The one is that it's from an Arabic verbal root meaning to flow. I don't speak Arabic, and I've heard other people say that's nonsense, and I forget where I read it, so maybe I should scratch that from the list. Another is that it's a back formation from the Latin generatio. A third is that it's from the Old French haras, H-A-R-A-S, which means stable, like the stables where you keep the horses, and presumably also where you breed the horses, right? And that's a nice etymology because it emphasizes the origins in animal husbandry. Now, I'm sorry, I heard you mention something I said about Plato's Republic in the book, is that right?
No. I just wondered if you could speak to the passages in Plato's Republic where he's supposedly, I hate to use the term, but eugenics that sometimes it's referred to.
Sure.
And also the use of ethnos just across the literature in New Testament or elsewhere or in Greek.
Oh yeah, thanks. Certainly, I think ethnos is a term that it's sometimes translated into Latin as either deus or natio. You also see sometimes in French historians use the term ethnie, E-T-H-N-I-E, or ethnie, to refer to, let's say, a nation in the sense not of a nation state, but let's say a group of people that would have grounds for making the case for a nation state in terms expounded by 19th century nationalism. That's an ethnie, right? How many ethnies are there? I think one of the things that's interesting in the 17th century is that they're trying to come to terms with the fact that there are more ethnies than there could ever possibly be states. And Leibniz himself certainly recognizes or does not recognize, let's say, the right to self-determination of every ethne. For example, in his correspondences with Peter the Great and his counselors, Leibniz frequently says that one of the things that makes the Russian Empire so great is how many nations or ethnies it has within it. These are just part of the features of this basic political formation, which is the empire. But an ethne also, this is an aspect that I didn't get to in the talk itself, is also, I think, the primary unit, so to speak, of Leibniz's theory of human difference, in that it is something that is linguistically and culturally defined, and what is peculiar linguistically and culturally might be kind of coextensive with unique or distinctive physical traits, skin color or flatness or bulging character of the nose or whatever, but those aren't for Leibniz relevant to the determination of the ethnos. The only thing that's relevant is culture and language, which Leibniz frequently emphasizes creates, so to speak, the political correlate of a metaphysical monad, which is to say a world apart, something that is, so to speak, incomparable and explicable only on its own terms. Now, this is what I've been criticized pretty sustainedly in the book Another Mind-Body Problem for excusing Leibniz's racism, the argument being that ethno-linguistic othering is potentially just as racist as, let's say, othering on the basis of unchangeable phenotypic traits like skin color. And certainly it can, there's no question that there are cases of racialized persecution on the basis of nothing more than linguistic and cultural difference, even where, if you're looking, say, at the genetic or phenotypic difference, there is none, right? In cases of, say, conflict between, say, the former Yugoslavia, for example, we could just, make such a long list of historical examples of this. That's just obvious. But I take Leibniz's kind of ethnic monadism, if you want to put it that way, or the idea that each ethno-linguistic community is a world apart, as a kind of precursor to a kind of Herderian communitarianism. That is to say, something along the lines of Herder's view in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, that each political community is a thing unto itself and cannot be measured in the way that Enlightenment figures would want to measure it in terms of a universal grid of greater or lesser progress. And that communitarianism, which would be compared, is also sometimes called soft nationalism. It has a historical link to hard nationalism. It's not multiculturalist. It has its problems. It's something that's charged, but it is also a legitimate response in a counter-Enlightenment vein to the imposition of a single universal grid. And again, I see Leibniz as belonging more to that vein than to the one represented by, for example, Kant or Diderot or Voltaire or a number of other figures in the Holland movement. No, stop there. I'm sorry, I'm not too long.
Did the evidence of interracial sexual relations impact this particular time period?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you speak up, or can the question be repeated in a microphone with better connection?
I said, did the evidence of interracial sexual relations have any impact on this period of racial science?
Oh yeah. I mean, obviously, like this is, I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk. You might be aware that a biological species is only kind of a, so to speak, a freeze frame at a moment in history of something that's always historically evolving. And in that respect, you might be inclined to say that crows and pigeons are not natural kinds in a rigorous sense. And yet, if you try to make a crow and a pigeon, you'll be so frustrated that you will, kind of have a reason to say, you know what, crows and pigeons are real. You can't just do whatever you want with them. Nature kicks back if you try to make them, right? Now, obviously, that's the point at which the race-species analogy, where we're using race and species in a 1920 and 21st century sense, that's the point at which the analogy just obviously falls apart, right? Now, a famous kind of anecdote that reveals the great lengths that people went to make this analogy work is in a now derogatory racial term that first emerged in the context of Spanish America, which is mulatto, right? A mulatto is someone who is, so to speak, like a mule. That is to say, a mule being a hybrid of a horse and a donkey, right? Now, there was theoretical kind of engagement with the mule problem going back to Aristotle, right? Aristotle said that nature hates hybridity, or as he put it, monstrosity, so much that she nips monstrosity in the bud by ensuring that all mules are born sterile, right? That is to say, okay, maybe in some cases, members of two different species can create a monstrous offspring, but it can't go any further than that, right? Now, obviously, again, it's a derogatory term, but I need to invoke it in order to make the point. Obviously, in this respect, a mulatto is no mule, right? The child of two parents of different races can obviously have children of his or her own. And so obviously nature does not nip the process in the bud there, and obviously this can be taken as an indication that nature doesn't hate interracial children. From a natural point of view, from a naturalized nature of hate, this is something that nature accommodates. And so this really kind of is a strong signal that that from the beginning, the race-species analogy was a sort of forced visual thinking, and that the prohibition here was not nature rendering something impossible, but rather civic law and legal and violent discrimination ensuring that what is naturally perfectly possible nonetheless not happen. Right? So I think I could go on and on about the difficulties of that. Authors such as Blumenbach explicitly says, well, it's not just mulatto, but also these even finer grained notions like quadroon and octoroon and so on. Blumenbach says plainly these are classificatory terms that could only ever possibly have local salience, right? Salience within the context of the plantation, as Blumenbach puts it. Whereas if you transplant someone who is in a local context, an octoroon, here into Göttingen, as he puts it, that person will not stay an octoroon, right? It's arbitrary to the point, to such an obvious point that you can't even pretend it's a classificatory term that designates a natural plant in the same way that horse and donkey do. Any more questions?
I'm
Okay.
interested.
Question.
You have a question?
Okay.
I wanted to know, you said that anthropological and I guess anatomical racism became embedded in the 1770s. How does that relate to slavery? If slavery started in North and South America in the 1600s, can you provide maybe more clarity on that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so in the 1730s and 40s, in France in particular, there is a lot of theoretical reflection on the nature of skin color, the causes of differences of skin color between different groups. And this is something that is always kind of discussed in close kind of discursive connection to the reality of slavery in the Americas and to the transatlantic slave trade. Most of these treatises are extremely racist, overtly trying to establish, it's in a number of these treatises that you find repeated and amplified this idea that black skin is thicker and therefore less responsive to pain than the skin of Europeans. And you have sometimes anonymous, but not always, treatises trying to ground this in, studies under the microscope on real skin samples. And of course, if you go back earlier than that, the early 18th century French context, you will also find Spanish 16th century explanations of physical difference. But what I want to emphasize, and again, these are always generalizations, and generalizations always have counterexamples, and I'm aware of that. I don't want to make any definitive claim. But for the most part, if you look, for example, at the Spanish scholastic debates that I discussed, that I invoked from the 1550s about the souls of Native Americans and whether they are suitable for slavery, the question of the potential natural slavery of Native Americans is one that, for the most part, did not dwell on the physical difference of Native Americans. There are some passages that say that they're shorter, some that say that they're stockier than Europeans. Very often, you get zero description of physical difference at all, and very often you get observations to the effect that the physical difference for Europeans is not significant. This is at a time, I mentioned in passing, when Native Americans were theorized by some people to have Scandinavian origins, to have arrived in the Americas by a North Atlantic route via Iceland and Greenland. Grotius, for example, is someone who argues for that, and even tries to find Germanic origins for Nahuatl or Aztec place names, right? So what I'm saying is that early on, physical difference was not the locus of the attempts to justify inegalitarianism. In the 1730s, as I mentioned, it becomes the locus, and the focus is on overwhelmingly on the skin. Now, what I want to emphasize about the 1770s, and the reason I pinpoint that as the moment of a significant change, is because we have Blumenbach explicitly saying that these people who were focusing on skin color were wasting their time. That was nothing. Skin doesn't matter. Skin color can differ from one group of people to another, or even within the same population in various very extreme ways. It doesn't matter. What does matter for Blumenbach? The answer is bones, skeletons. And to some extent, Blumenbach really did observe significant features of human skeletons, some of which are mappable across populations. And so in that respect, even if it is a tainted science from its beginnings, there is a respect in which you can say that, that physical anthropology as the scientific study of human diversity begins in the 1770s by focusing on, so to speak, that which lasts in human populations, that which is known as human. This is also, of course, the beginning of the period of not skeletometry in general, but also craniometry, which is, of course, the beginning of a long history of the racist and biased study of differences in human skull size across populations, which wrongly rooted human intelligence in cranial capacity and which tended to falsify data so as to make Europeans come out as having larger skulls, right? So it's a long and complicated history, but that's the limited respect in which I wanted to say that physical anthropology.
Hi, John.
I'm sorry, I went on too long.
You're not supposed to be in the meeting from yesterday. You're supposed to be in the one that I sent you, the other one. Yeah, it's okay.
I have a question.
Time's fine.
So, you talked about the 1500s and that physical differences was not the locus for slavery. Was the locus simply that the people were the other?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything, I'm sorry.
The speaker is up here, you need to stand up and kind of speak near it.
Is this working?
I can hear Susan very well.
These people all have teacher voices, so.
Is this one working?
Yeah, it should be. If not, just holler. We're also running our time down, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, I've talked to you all, so.
Okay, so you mentioned that in the 1500s, physical difference was not the locus for people deciding to enslave other people. So was the locus then simply that those people were the other that brought them into slavery?
Yeah, it's a very complicated history, and I think this is getting out of my scholarly domain, but one thing that I like to point out is it's largely circumstance of, let's say, the flow of information in the 16th century that can help us to understand how Europeans could encounter Native Americans and Africans and East Asians and South Asians and not speak in the same way people would later on about physical difference. And in part, the explanation is that they didn't have photography and they didn't have iPhones recording and documenting and transmitting every single encounter, right? They didn't have very good technologies for reproducing likenesses in books and so on. And so the look of people was not first and foremost the most salient bit of information. It was what they did and said and how formidable they were in war and resistance most often, right? Now, again, this is also getting way out of my scholarly domain, but I think most historians in the early years of slave raiding of the Portuguese, the Iberians into Africa, into West Africa, will also emphasize that there was not an immediate emphasis on any kind of phenomenally salient difference between human beings there and the human beings here. There was rather a continuation of a regional norm of slave raiding, which in earlier centuries also included, raiding of the North African coastline, Ottoman raiding in the Caucasus, taking French and Spanish and English sailors as slaves who were captured and so on. And so the reason why there seemed to be a moral and political justification of the enslavement of West Africans in the early years of slavery was, again, of that long history, was not necessarily because of a prior commitment to any kind of inequality as discernible through differences of physical appearance or other differences, but rather just a prior presumption that slavery is a legitimate institution. Right? But that's beyond my scholarly bailiwick, so I hesitate to go there, though I do cite a number of historians on the topic.
Okay, thank you very much.